thank you for listening to this story. A question which comes up for me when I read or hear or tell a story like this is it just a cartoon? There's a voice in my head which craves depth from story. And that voice gets a little uppity and says, I don't know, is this just a circus of images? Does it mean anything? So I'm just going to say that because perhaps it's a thought you've had or maybe not. And we will come back to that later. Because the rest of me or other parts of me just love this story. The things which I go to, the magnetic mountain. Well, hang on, let's back up. The bag. I don't know, I read that and my eyes nearly popped out of my head when I read this story. I love it. It's an imagination contest, really, right? It's these two fellows, characters in the story, trying to dream up the most crazy things that can go into this bag. And then, of course, I think about the fact that these stories in this collection were told, of course, for a long time by storytellers. They are still told in parts of the world. And I can put myself into the heart and mind of that other storyteller, making up this list, perhaps on the fly, of things in the bag, which is just an outrageous list, of course. That's the point. And of course, I did my own thing with it and made up some stuff. But the actual text here, the actual book, the actual story is just as nutty. I could read you a little bit of it. This is from the translation by Malcolm Lyons, Lyons, which came out just a few years ago. And just to give you an idea, this is what one fellow says. He says, I came forward bursting with rage and said, may God aid our master, the Qadi. That's the word for the judge. In this bag of mine is a coat of mail, a sword, and stores of weapons. There are 1,000 budding rams, a sheepfold, 1,000 barking dogs, orchards, vines, flowers, scented herbs, figs, apples, pictures and statues, bottles and drinking cups, beautiful slave girls, singing girls, wedding feasts with noise and tumult, wide open spaces, successful men, dawn raiders with swords, spears, bows, and arrows, friends, dear ones, companions, comrades, men imprisoned and awaiting punishment, drinking companions, mandolins, flutes, banners, and flags, boys, girls, unveiled brides, and singing slave girls. There are 5 girls from Abyssinia, 3 from India, 4 from Al-Medina, 20 from Rum, 50 Turkish girls and 70 Persians, 80 Kurdish girls and 90 Georgians. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are there, together with a fishing net, flint and steel for striking sparks, Iram of the columns, that's a palace, and 1,000 good-for-nothings and pimps. There are exercise grounds, stables, mosques, baths, a builder, a carpenter, a plank of wood, a nail, a black slave with a fife, a captain and a groom, cities and towns, 100,000 dinars, Kufa and Al-Anbar, 20 chests filled with materials, 50 storehouses for food, Gaza, Ascalon, the land from Damietta to Aswan, the palace of Khosrow Anushirwan, the kingdom of Solomon, the land from Wadi Numan to Khorasan, as well as Balkh and Isfahan and what lies between India and the land of the blacks. It also contains, may God prolong the life of our master the Qadi, gowns, turban cloth, and 1,000 sharp razors to shave off the Qadi's beard, unless he fears my vengeance and rules of the bag is mine. So that's the verbatim list from the actual story. There's no David Bowie in it. I added him, or Michael Jackson. But it gives you an idea of what the original is like. And we see here in the 1001 Nights something which we have a lot of, which is abundance and wonder, both. I mean, we get abundance. First of all, it's an abundance of stories. People just jammed one story after another into this collection, and it's piled with stories, 1001 Nights, as if it contains the universe itself. That's the idea. And so here in a microcosm, as it were, in this story of the bag, we have great abundance. And it's an abundance that we can perhaps relate to. Fairy tales and other stories of this world, some of the myths, go back very far. They're very old, thousands of years old, and they are very elemental in a way. They speak to essential problems in a community and how to solve them. And you throw in a bunch of medieval trappings and stage setting, but basically they're pretty simple. Man and a woman want to have a child, they don't have a child, things like that. Whereas the Arabian Nights comes from a more urban civilization. It comes from a situation where there are things and there are merchants and there is a dialogue with other cultures, which is very intense and complicated and worked out. So you get these things, these long lists of stuff, which we can perhaps relate to because we live in a world of stuff as well. So this story, I just love the imagination of it. And then later on, what do we get? The Magic Mountain. Magic Mountain, I should say. Later on, we get the Magnetic Mountain, which I love as well. Can you imagine it? Can you see that thing there in the ocean, covered in old stoves and hinges and anchors and swords and pots and pans? This big black thing covered with all the metals that humans have used and made into stuff. And it's all there on this big, huge mountain, which is greedy in a way. Allah gave it a love for iron, and so it brings all those things to itself. Much as these stories, in a way, are greedy, much as these stories have a love for so many things of the world and bring them into it, into these stories. Just amazing. So the wonder of these stories is what grabs me. And it's interesting thinking about where we grow up, where I grew up, and perhaps you as well. Growing up in upstate New York, the landscape I was presented with was not a landscape alive with story. It was a landscape where I had to put the stories in, and I did that with my friends and stuff like that. But I got stories from the television and from the movies. And these stories were not related to the land on which I lived. In a more deeply rooted culture, the stories and the myths are right there. You have a story about the oak tree. The wind in those leaves is the voice of Zeus, perhaps, for the ancient Greeks. You would go to that oak tree, you would hear that sound, and you would remember that story about Zeus. I didn't have that. I'm guessing you didn't have that either. Dear listener, I'm just guessing. Who knows? Maybe you did. But in that environment, it seems conducive to stories which bring in the wonder because you're so hungry for it. Especially as a child, you want there to be wonder and magic in the world. You not just want, you feel that that's a truth of the universe, of the world, that magic and wonder are out there. They've got to be. But you're surrounded by school, you're surrounded by a house, which the magic isn't quite there, perhaps. Maybe it is. I don't want to speak for you, of course, but let me speak for myself. A lot of the magic came through books and stories and through the television set where I would watch stories. So I grew up with stories which were Superman, Batman, Star Wars, Star Trek, Indiana Jones. Lord of the Rings, not so much. You know these food groups. These are the basic food groups of life in America. You could add a whole bunch more, of course, but I'm just saying for myself. So those are stories with wonder in them and stories that aren't related to the place as much. Or in any way, really. They come from a distant land. So the Arabian Nights, I'm drawn to it because it provides that wonder which I have sought and still seek in the world. So that voice comes up for me, the voice which says, is it just a cartoon? Does it mean anything at all? And I guess I just have to let that voice go and not worry about that question or the answer to that question. Is there grief in this story? Not as much as some other stories. Is there sorrow? Not as much as other stories, that is for sure. But there is wonder, and that is something we also need, that the soul needs. And I think of places in this story that draw me in: the bag, the magnetic mountain, the dry well, learning from the genies in the dry well. Who wouldn't want to do that? From the kindly genies down there. So these images live in me, and perhaps they can live in you as well. Perhaps they do live in you. And then the next part, we get the guy who's turned into a gorilla. Yeah, turned into a gorilla. And something about that is hilarious and sad and beautiful, too. This man who writes poetry. And of course, as I've said on this podcast before, I'm a poet. I studied poetry. I love poetry. And so something in me just gets a kick out of that moment where the gorilla is writing poetry. And also the guy who says he brings his gift to the town, the woodcutter there, and the guy's like, "What can you do? How can you earn any money?" And he's like, "Well, I'm a poet. I know philosophy. I know poetry. I can write calligraphy." And the guy's like, "We don't need any of that here. We just need go to the forest, cut yourself some wood." And I am drawn to that moment too, because of course that's something I've heard. And I want to say, I don't want to say, but I want to say, especially in America, right? Poetry, what is that? We don't have time for that stuff. We've got stuff to do. We've got a country to build here. So the voice of that character in this story is familiar to me in a hilarious and sad way. The poems the gorilla writes, needless to say, I put them in there. In the actual Arabian Nights, they are different poems, but I chose to put in poems in English by Shakespeare, by Robert Bly, by Robert Frost, who else? T.S. Eliot as well. Bunch of poets there. And finally, at the end, we get this battle between the genie and this woman who studied with a woman of power and learned magic. And it's one of the most wildest sort of transformation battles I've run across. The story of Taliesin, that's a Welsh story in which there is also a chase, and they turn into animals, of course. Ceridwen and the boy who's going to become Taliesin, they chase each other through the forest in the shapes of various animals. And that chase has a different feeling than this one. Again, we get abundance and wonder and joy in those things, you know. Whoever's telling this story, whoever first told it, wherever it came from, there is a love of story itself, and of transformation, and of magic and wonder, of course. And I would also say there is something in these stories about fate, about the way in which our lives, our destinies, change in an instant, it seems. 1 minute you're in the king's court, the court of your father, and everything is great. The next moment you're floating in the sea. And then after that, suddenly you're a gorilla writing poetry on a piece of paper and playing chess with the king. And then you're a one-eyed dervish. So the transformations that characters in these stories go through are jaw-dropping and inspiring as well, and kind of take my breath away and seem very true. We live in a wild and whirling world where things change and transform all the time. And I am actually encouraged by the transformations in these stories. That your life can change. Now, I probably shouldn't be encouraged because what goes up can come down. But the fact that change on such a scale is possible for the individual is, even whether it's good or bad, so to speak, seems to be a measure of vitality, both in the universe and in the individual's own life path. Change as vitality itself. So I see that in the characters in these stories, and I like that. I love that. And I like thinking that such changes are possible. And as I get older, that seems more and more true. 1 minute you are canoeing in a canoe with your father in the back of the canoe. The next moment you are at the funeral of your father. The next moment you are pushing your daughter on a swing set where you were once pushed on a swing set by your father. And the next moment you're getting married, and the next moment you're cleaning out the compost at the food co-op in the town where you live. And the next moment you're in a skyscraper with a tie on, working a temp job, looking out at Central Park. So these transformations happen to us, and they are accelerated in these stories from 1001 Nights, but nevertheless, that feels true to me. I hope you can find places in this story that sing to you in some way. I hope you can find these stories talking back to you in your life, as I have. and as the characters Scheherazade, Dunyazad, and the king have as well. Thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you're able to support this podcast, please do so. These days especially, that helps make it happen. On Patreon, you can support me on the website, blah, blah, blah. There's more stories on my website if you're not there already, jayleeming.com, jayleeming.com. All those words I said are so orderly, so normal. So we must say firework. We must say watermelon, in which watermelon with a house inside where a woodcutter lives. He's not cutting wood, though, today. He's just whittling. He's taking a stick and turning it into a boat. His wife is there. She is also carving a stick and turning it into a boat. At the end, they're going to have two boats. They're going to put them on the water. They're going to watch them on a river floating away. And then the sun will go down and the stars will come out. And the stars will cry and weep for the day, which they love but have not seen in a long, long time. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and take care.